Anyone who has ever messed around on a piano, or a clarinet, or just whistled or sung for the joy of making sound is a composer. What professionals do is a sort of advanced version of that first playful moment, which is how many of us got hooked on creating music. This podcast is about our stories. Our goal is to illuminate, explore, and help demystify new music for listeners and musicians alike. This is Composer's Notes. I'm your host, Michael Small. Today we have a short interview with my good friend and colleague from Cornell, Tonia Coe. Tonia's piece Eyelids Are Islands was written between 2013 and 2014 and premiered at Cornell while we were both students. Tonia was brought up in Hong Kong and Hawaii and studied composition at the Eastman School of Music, Indiana Jacobs, and Cornell. Tonia's music, especially that written since 2012, is full of a wonderful sense of creativity, fun, and playfulness. She's written for large ensembles, orchestras, string quartets, and piano, as well as more unusual instrumentations, even a percussion quintet for electronics and bubble wrap. Here are Tonia's program notes about Eyelids Are Islands, which begins with some evocative free prose written by Tonia herself. When we finally blinked and opened our eyes, suddenly it appeared to be a completely different world. Even though all the same objects were there, we saw them anew, like in a dream, where you still call your best friend by the correct name, even though he looked entirely like a stranger. Despite constantly blinking in an attempt to refresh what we see, as if to wake up, we actually keep jumping from island to island, landing on a new world each time. And Tonia continues by saying, "My recent compositional interests are united by a desire to explode, to take apart and expand the sounds and movements of the everyday, unraveling a small idea and viewing it from different angles. In Eyelids Are Islands, the double bass functions as the heart of the ensemble body. Its sound injects frenetic energy and resonance throughout the group, so even a simple note on the awesome open E string has waves of harmonic and gestural repercussions." Here is a little excerpt from Eyelids Are Islands, performed by the Cornell Festival Chamber Orchestra and conducted by Christopher Kim. Tonia, thank you so much for being on our first episode, and welcome.
Hi, Michael.
So, perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about how you got started writing music.
Well, I guess I started quite young, but as a kid I was always making up songs that my family still remembers, and I also grew up going to a lot of shows of my father's or different musicals that my parents took us to, and I think composing just grew naturally out of different musical activities as I was involved in playing piano and viola in school orchestra and singing in choir. So when I was 12, I set a poem that a friend had written, and I made my choir friends sing it. And then soon after that, I think I was 14 or 15, I decided I wanted to write a piece for my school's string orchestra. So I just sort of downloaded notation software and did it. And things went on from there.
So did you have favorite composers at this point? Were you listening to a lot of music, or did you sort of have a particularly formative moment which set you off? Can you remember anything like that?
I'd say my formative years were kind of split into two parts. So I'd say on one hand, I made music very sort of unconsciously. I sang in choir where we, sang a lot of Hawaiian songs and danced hula. And I was also, when I was quite young, sort of making these musicals with my sister, taking after what my dad does. But on the other hand, I studied piano. And I would say when I was a teenager, I discovered two albums that I'd say were my first CDs. It was the Kronos Quartet Early Music album and the Juilliard String Quartet CD with, let's see, Debussy, Ravel, and Duthier, which I think a lot of people know and remember.
Yeah, that's a wonderful start. So were you largely self-taught until college, or did you have teachers before then?
Well, I guess I was self-taught up until that point when I decided to just write a string orchestra piece. After that, my orchestra director recommended that I take lessons. And so I studied with Donald Womack at the University of Hawaii for about 1.5 years before I went off to college. And he really taught me, a lot of the technique and theory that helped me get into Eastman.
I see. So how much do you think your music has changed over time? Are there sort of attitudes or perspectives you have now which only developed more recently?
I'd say my music has changed a lot, like a lot. Just because composing for me is so tied to me growing as a person. And I feel like a totally different person from when I first started. I think composing, I wrote this down before, but it's all about facing fears. And I think that's a big part of my life because I started out as such like a grumpy and terrified kid that I'm trying to use composing to sort of open myself up to the world, I guess. I really try to push my sound world with every piece. And I think especially since I started at Cornell in 2012, the hard thing with this attitude or this process is, I'm always in new territory, so I can't guarantee that every piece is going to be perfect. And then also I can't go back to what I've done because I'm so different myself. I feel like it's sort of, I think about this a lot because I'm from faraway places, but the feeling of going home and feeling this disconnect between this place you know really well and yourself, who's like a totally different person. And I think that's very similar in composing too.
Absolutely. So a little bit about how you write. So when you're beginning a piece, is there a consistent starting point or thought, or do you change your process each time?
I do have certain activities I do to get me started. It's hard for me to remember the process of writing pieces, as I'm sure you know. There's amnesia that has a list of activities that I tend to do. I try to reevaluate the instruments I'm writing for. Not necessarily listening to every piece that's been written for that instrumentation, but just looking at enough pieces to make me think carefully about the instruments. And then I tend to write down a lot of just prose or words of characters I want to portray. I also doodle a lot on paper. Yeah, it's just, I'm just trying to find the why behind the piece. I think for me, composing, I need a reason to make a piece, even if it's a tiny little poetic idea. And I hope that, if the idea is good, the how of it will just come naturally.
So, for example, with your with Eyelids Are Islands, you had that piece of prose that now sits in the program notes. Is that one of those starting points?
Yeah, so I wrote that bit of prose after I finished the piece. Yeah, it's a guide to the form of the piece because I kind of jump around from island to island musically. But I would say the main why of Eyelids Are Islands, it's just a reimagining of the ensemble as this body, which it's got a heart and eyes that blink at each other.
Yeah. I know that you often have visual associations with your music, and I'd like to get a little bit further into this idea. So this might be a sort of 3 or 4-parter question. So do you ever think visually when you're composing?
I think about music often in terms of curves and angles and lines and dots. So it's extremely abstract. I tend not to just have a landscape or anything like that. It's just these little shapes that bounce around. It makes it easy for me to draw them out also. But I do think it's still tied to theater or drama and how these sorts of characters of shapes interact with each other. I guess this question made me think of this. I think it's a film from the teens. It's this black and white abstract film by Viking Egeling called Diagonal Symphony, which has been scored by Olga Neuwirth. But I forget how long it is. It's like maybe 9 minutes of these shapes bouncing around. And I guess I do think about my music like that.
Yeah, this also sort of reminds you of the parts of Fantasia that were never made, got cut out because Disney didn't want them in there. So yeah, I guess bouncing off that question, do you think the drama and the idea of stage and drama, is that something that maybe came from your early experiences with watching plays, watching musicals, and so on?
Definitely. My father is a director and a producer in Hong Kong, and he makes films and musicals. So I sort of grew up running around backstage and on the sets. And I think watching the actors work was very formative for me, and it's something I'm trying to tap into more and more in my music.
So does it also ever happen when you're listening? Do you listen visually in a sense? Do you think of shapes and patterns in music as if they were visual in that respect?
On that side of it, I think it's a bit less frequent that I do that. I don't have like shape synesthesia.
Yeah.
So it's not like, I involuntarily do this sort of visualization. I mean, I'm a composer. I just really try to listen to the sounds. But I would say some pieces are inherently more visual than others. Mm-hmm. Like if the structure, the architecture is really super clear, then, those ideas do pop up.
Sure. So moving on from that, in addition to composing, you also create visual, sculptural, and installation art. And that seems to be something that developed much more during your time at Cornell. So maybe tell us a little bit more about how that grew for you.
Sure. I'd say I'm still sort of new at making visual art. It's something I want to do much more. But when I got to Cornell, it was, my first year not in conservatory. So in a way, it was quite liberating. I took an independent study with a professor in the art department for a semester. I just made drawings and I took them in a composition lesson. And I think being in a flexible program like Cornell, I actually had time to just sort of explore these kinds of things. When I discovered bubble wrap, I think that's when it really took off. And it was actually the first material where I could integrate the two, making music and art.
So how do you see this sort of cross-pollinated creativity continuing? And if so, do you have any ideas of what you might do next with it?
Well, I have grand plans to work with bubble wrap more. So I made a solo piece and a quintet with electronics. And I think on the using live electronics side, I want to do an installation where there's visual tracking that goes on with my art. Because I just paint in black and white on the bubble side. And if I could assign different sounds to when the bubbles are black or when they're white, that could be really cool. I also have been practicing bubble wrap lately, and I can sort of play pitches now and control the rhythms a little better. So my dream is to do a humongous concerto for myself. With bubble wrap.
That's wonderful. So building on this, you frequently, and you mentioned this earlier, you frequently focused on particular instruments as driving forces in your pieces, notably stringed instruments, especially the double bass in Eyelids, the celesta, and in this case, bubble wrap too. So what is it that sort of attracted you to these instruments, and how have they changed the way you think about composing?
I would say the first piece that sort of has this attitude towards using instruments is my piece for violin and harpsichord. It's called Still Life Crumbles, where I had all this time to just go in the harpsichord and try every single stop. And it was sort of, it's something that I, in theory, knew I should be doing with every instrument I write for. But now it's really been a way for me to develop a close relationship with my own pieces, if that makes any sense. So I like to find little sounds that draw out some personality in the instrument. So it's sort of like writing a play or something where you develop the personality of a character. That I think that's really had a profound impact on the music I write.
Right. So finally, tell us a little bit about how you wrote Eyelids Are Islands, the artistic inspiration of Pennone, but also how long did it take, and did you have to rewrite any parts or course correct? What were any sort of stumbling blocks you might have reached?
So Eyelids Are Islands was inspired by a huge diptych by Giuseppe Pennone, and I saw this at in the Netherlands. They had an Art Povera exhibition there. So this piece of art, it just looked like a black pattern on massive pieces of paper, and it was called Right Eyelid, Left Eyelid, or maybe the other way around, I don't know. But I was very struck when I discovered that the whole thing was just impressions of the artist's own eyelids. So it was like the pattern of your skin, and he sort of magnified and tessellated this pattern all over the wall. So I think besides that, this inspiration really manifested itself more abstractly in my piece. So the idea that the double bass is this like heartbeat that, kind of injects the entire ensemble with energy, and that in the corners of the ensemble you have the celesta and the vibraphone sort of blinking at each other as the eyes. I wrote the piece at the Copeland House. So this was December 2013 to January 2014. And I spent a month there, and this piece was basically all I did. And I would say because I was so focused there with Aaron Copland's portrait staring at me all day, I had a very clear idea of the form. So it kind of wrote itself pretty quickly. Some sections took longer than others, but I would say the stumbling block really happened after I wrote this piece. I had to start another one. Then I had trouble. But no rewriting or anything sort of came out.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, Tonia.
Thanks, Michael.
So, thank you for listening. For Composer's Notes, I'm Michael Small.